Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing a video that I recently watched by Violin Mechanic, and it's really not so much about the video, it's more about discussions that I saw happening in the comments and that just touched on questions that I myself have been asking myself as a teacher. So first I'll just introduce myself. My name's Hannah Smith, and I have been teaching violin for about 4 years. I do not have a music degree. It's not something that I was officially trained in. However, I have been playing violin for 28 years. I had a lot of wonderful teachers, both pre-college and during college. I did orchestra, summer camps, I've played for weddings, I've played for bands, I've played in all different sorts of venues, and I think have a lot of experience to offer. And quite frankly, got into teaching because there just really weren't any options in the area I was living in, and there was a huge need for strings teachers that I was able to satisfy. But I have to admit, sometimes the lack of credentials is a point of insecurity for me. I don't have the technical skill required to give input at higher levels. However, I do think Violin Mechanic touched on this topic by saying that just because you're a prodigy doesn't make you a good teacher, and there are many good teachers who don't have the best technical capabilities. And I think that that in itself is an interesting discussion, but I'm not going to be diving too much into that today, why that is. But I would like to believe that I'm a picture of that. Maybe I'm not the most technically capable, but I do have a heart for children. I do have an ability to communicate to them what is missing, to help coach their mindset, and to help them just continue in their journey of learning to love and play music. So one of the questions that was kind of posited in the comments, it wasn't posited this clearly, but this discussion of, can teachers kind of poison the well of their students by being very rigid and only teaching technical excellence and discipline? And I think the answer to that is just a clear, resounding yes. And to make it clear, I think Violin Mechanic kind of touched on that as well. Again, just with this idea that just because you're a wonderful player doesn't necessarily make you a great teacher. So I'm not going to be talking too much about the actual TedX Talk and that particular player that Violin Mechanic was critiquing. I think his critique was really good, really solid. There's really not much more to be said on that. Rather, I'm just going to be touching on like this abstract idea of teachers and kind of poisoning the well for their students, and then go a few steps beyond that. Ask some questions beyond that that get to the heart of this teacher-student dynamic and what it looks like to grow in your musical abilities, as well as maintaining and even growing your love for music and your love for playing, especially when you hit some of those dry patches in your playing, which is inevitable. Can a teacher poison the well? Absolutely. Here are some questions that I think you need to follow up with. What is a teacher's responsibility to his or her students? So that's a big question. That's one I'm asking myself, and I'm going to give an answer to that later just based on where I currently am in my own teaching journey. And I'm sure that might evolve over the years, but I think I have a pretty good grasp on what that looks like just based on my 4 years of teaching and my exposures to some really good teachers and what they helped me through. So the next question would be, is the progress of the student mainly the teacher or the student's responsibility? And this is a question I don't think gets asked enough or discussed enough, at least from what I've seen. A lot of it either falls on the teacher or on the student. So I want to jump into that and what my perspective is on that as both having been a student and a teacher. So another question I think should be asked is, what balance of fun and drills should be maintained in your musical education? I gave a resounding yes to, can a teacher poison a student's well? But I think the inverse needs to be asked. Can a student poison the teacher's well? So we're going to get into these questions. So starting in the first one, What are the responsibilities of a teacher towards his or her student? In the vein of the Suzuki philosophy, I do my best to help both the student and the parent and educate them both to help them better know what in-house practice looks like, because in-house practice is the bedrock of growth. You can see me once a week for half an hour. You can even see me for an hour. That is not going to be the main bulk of your progress. Now, I am still learning in how to do that because there's so many different family dynamics, and you'll definitely come across families. This is really only seen as something that, like, it's just for fun, just something that my child enjoys. And I find that that's usually a challenging dynamic to deal with, because the expectation from the parent for their child is, I just want this to be fun. Well, inevitably in your musical journey, it's not going to be fun at some point. It's just not. No matter, even if I keep the focus on just kind of fun music and I don't become like that drill sergeant, even in fun music, you have to do difficult work. And one of the things more recently that I've really been switching in my approach to teaching is to help my students be able to critique themselves on their own. So, and I really emphasize to them that critique is both positive and negative feedback. The heart of learning is a desire to want to improve. And in order to improve, you have to be able to face yourself where you currently stand. And you have to be able to do that with both the good and the bad. And here's where a teacher can poison the well with their student. I think it's not because they overemphasize technique. I think what happens is the teacher never stops to teach their student how to celebrate where they've come from. They don't point out the mile markers, and they don't encourage them to recognize improvement where there is improvement. It's very tempting when a student finally reaches a milestone to just move on to the next one, which I think is great. You don't want to just stay in the same place forever. But if you just move on without kind of acknowledging this is what you've overcome, even with like beginners, they're learning Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Once a student has learned a song, you usually kind of move on to the next one. But you keep that old song in your practice routine. You continue to polish it. You continue to improve it. I try to help my students understand that us going back in the book is not a regression. It's not me telling them, you're not improving enough, so we have to go back. Now, there are times where that might happen. And like I think Violin Mechanic pointed out, it's a lifelong habit to practice both advanced but also basic techniques. Right now, I'm really focusing on my bowing. And I do remember my teacher in high school telling me I was so frustrated with my left hand. And I was just convinced that I could not play in tune, that I could not make it sound good. And it was because I didn't properly know my left hand. And she pointed out to me, actually, I think that you're really tense in your right arm, in your bow arm. And because of that, it's not producing a really pleasant sound. You can get it perfectly right in the left hand, but if the bow's not drawing properly, it's not going to make a good sound. It will even kind of sound out of tune, even if it's not, just because it sounds bad. Learning to understand what you're hearing and what the problem is. At the time, I didn't believe her. So I was that student who thought I knew better than my teacher. And quite frankly, I suffered for it because I didn't really take her advice seriously, but she was right. And now looking back, I don't have a teacher at this point in my life. I am my own teacher and some wonderful people on YouTube, but I have to go back and really evaluate my bow. And I will go back and I will play really easy songs, and I will just solely focus on using my full range of bowing. It doesn't matter how long you've been playing. It doesn't matter what level you are at. You're always going to kind of pick up those foundational premises, get reacquainted with them, maybe even play around with them a little bit. But for people who are beginners and they don't really have that ability to go back, I do believe that that is one of the responsibilities of a teacher, is to actually teach your students how to properly criticize yourself. Another responsibility that the teacher has towards their student is to introduce them to good music, especially for younger students. A lot of your musical development comes from what you listen to. And again, this is kind of a Suzuki principle of listening as part of practice. I don't think that's just Suzuki. I know many other teaching methods really emphasize listening, as they should. And I do think that listening to what you're practicing is important. But I also believe that just listening for the sake of listening, exploring different music, being introduced to great music, being able to articulate what you like about that music, or maybe what you don't like about that music, just kind of developing your own taste. And the teacher's role in that is just to kind of spread the feast. That's like a Charlotte Mason. If you're familiar with Charlotte Mason, you as a teacher prioritizing what is good and beautiful and presenting that to the student so that they have a better frame of reference for what is out there and what makes good music good. Another area in which I think teachers have a responsibility towards their students is in the areas of performance and group play. And I think that these are really important elements of music. If you're always practicing, but you never or rarely perform, and it doesn't even have to be at a high level. It can be for family or friends. It can be at a retirement center. It can be at your church. It can be at so many different venues. But if you're not playing for a crowd, if you're never performing, then you kind of lose some of that focus on why music is important. It's so important because of how it connects us to other people and the world around us, to God, to so many different things. Like if you are only playing for yourself, I really think you're missing a huge part of that. And going along with that is group play. And group play is important because you learn so much from playing with other people. And you also really see why the technique is so valuable. Because quite frankly, I could play a piece and not play it very technically well. And I could get away with it if I was, one, doing it by myself, and two, playing in front of a crowd that isn't familiar with that kind of music. It might be perfectly fine. But when you're playing with a group and you're playing for a crowd who is familiar with that music, it's really important for that group to be in sync, to really listen to one another, to really play together. I think it's just such an important part of your musical development. The final thing I would say in terms of a teacher's responsibility to their student is to get to know the student and to help them refine their goals, for lack of a better term, maybe their purpose with music. A lot of this is, something kind of coaching their mindset. So when they do hit that dry space, how do you get through that? Just telling your student that's going to happen. That is part of it. That is not something that you can just avoid. It's a lot like exercise. If you get into any sort of exercise routine, there's going to come a point where it's a dry spell. You don't enjoy it. You don't want to do it. And all you have to do is just get your shoes on and set the time and go. And then from there, take it from there. And that's what I tell my students. When they hit that dry spell, I say, first of all, this is going to happen. If you only expect to play for as long as you enjoy it, you will quit. You will, because there's going to come a time where you don't enjoy it. So be prepared for that. And I tell that to parents as well, because if a parent's expectation is, I want my kid to have fun, and they themselves don't understand that part of the musical journey is hitting those walls and learning to overcome them, then they're going to allow their child to quit because it's not fun anymore. You as a teacher are doing your student a disservice if you put it completely on yourself to always make it fun, because you're not preparing them for the reality that it's not always going to be fun. How do we continue on when we don't want to, because that's not just a music skill, that is a life skill. And that's one reason I think music is such an important thing for children to learn, because yes, the discipline and the joy, and there's so many things that come out of it. Your studio is kind of like a gym for life. It's like where you do that training for life lessons that you're going to learn in every other area of life. But, the consequences are not as always as great. With music, it can be much harder if you are not disciplined in other areas of life once you become an adult. So music is kind of that fun place to learn discipline and to learn to love discipline. I mean, again, I think that's kind of a responsibility that a teacher has. I can't force a student to enjoy the discipline, but I can help teach them that process. I can do my best to help them learn to love discipline. I do believe that eventually, and this gets into one of the later questions, I do think eventually it becomes the student's responsibility. But if I, as a teacher, do not prepare my student to face that reality, that they have to learn to love the discipline, I am failing as a teacher in that area. So that really leads us into the next question. I've already partly answered that, but that is the progress of the student mainly the responsibility of the teacher or the student? This is a really tough one. I do think that there are phases. I do think for young children and early beginners, that is mainly on the teacher. But it's not completely on the teacher. I think some people come to a teacher as I'm going to seek out a teacher so that they can do the work of growing for me. And I think if you're coming in with that mindset, it doesn't matter how great of a teacher you have, you're not going to advance very well. But if you are coming in with a mindset of, I want to learn this thing, and I know that it would serve me much better to have someone to guide me through that process, and so I'm going to have this person guide me through that process, you're going to do much better for yourself, because again, the bulk of progress is in your practice. It's going to be what you do on your own time. Now, as a teacher, especially with young children or beginners, I really set up our lesson time to look like how I want them to practice, because I don't want lesson just to be me telling them what to do, and then when they go home, they don't remember what I told them what to do, or they don't really have that vision of what playing looks like, and playing how you want them to practice, because then when they go home, they're just going to kind of repeat what they did in lesson. So if you set your lesson up like a practice, I think they're much more likely to succeed and just have an innate ability on how to practice without overthinking it.
So to summarize, I would say where the teacher's responsibility lies, especially with beginner and young children, is to help them realize the vision of what they could do, the potential of what they could do in their playing. And you do that by providing opportunities, again, listening opportunities, performing opportunities, group playing opportunities, and I'll get into some of that later, or also just introducing them to beautiful music. That helps to inspire your students to create a vision so that they can start to take ownership of their own musical progress. So I do think, especially with young children and beginners, that's where the teacher's responsibility lies. But where the student's responsibility lies is to take ownership of their own development at some point. And once they have a clear vision on what they want that development to look like, where they want it to lead, what their goals are, they need to put in the work that it takes. They also may need to present to their teacher, this is what I want. And that doesn't have to be a classical performing soloist. I saw this comment on Violin Mechanics channel about a teacher who basically said to their student, okay, well, if this is all you're going to do, you'll only be, all you'll ever do is be like a wedding musician or something. which I find funny because I have been a wedding musician and I loved it. I think that's a great gig. And quite frankly, 90% of music that you hear in your daily life, it's going to be the weddings, it's going to be the church, it's going to be the open mics, it's going to be the street performers, it's going to be going on YouTube and, seeking out different artists. And that could be someone like Hilary Hahn, but that could also be someone like that I love, Taylor Reed, who, as far as I think, she doesn't have any violin training, but she's a looping artist and she's able to create amazing music with what she's got. And it doesn't have to be the most advanced technical piece, but it's still beautiful, fun, and creative. And I think actually the most technically advanced, while important and beautiful and deserves a place of respect. I truly believe that. I truly believe that those top performers do deserve respect that other musicians might not get. At the same time, I don't think that the respect that they are given should come at a cost at the musicians who are going to provide 90% of music in your life. So you don't need to demean the wedding musician for the sake of promoting Hilary Hahn. There's different skills required for different types of music or different venues of playing. So quite frankly, many top-notch performers probably won't play weddings very well because it's so about the performance. It's so about the masterful piece and having an audience that's really hanging on to every note of that masterful piece. But that's not what a wedding's about. You have to be able to work with people. You have to understand how the event is run, how to be on good terms with people who might be in a very heightened state of anxiety and let's get the show on. And you have to be able to take it in stride, play beautifully. You might have to be willing to stop mid-piece in a way that sounds seamless, but it's mid-piece and you have to figure out how to do that so that you can prepare for the entrance of the bride. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not going to be a good wedding musician. Or as a wedding musician, it would be in your best interest to select music that you could play for a very long period of time. Because if you signed up for an hour, but then there's a delay in the wedding, you best have music to fill that gap that you can play readily, that you have with you, that you don't have to put much practice in, so that people have the music that they paid for and wanted during that time. So there's a lot of other skills in that type of musicianship that you might not get from being a top-notch performer. On a bit of a tangent. But I think what I'm trying to address here is that when it comes to the student's responsibility, take ownership of your musical journey. Know what you want. Like when your teacher presents you with different types of playing, different venues to play, figure out which one you really enjoy and why, and if you'd want to pursue that further. Oh my gosh, I'm going on such a tangent. The point is that when it comes to responsibility, if I had to summarize, for the student, learn to take ownership for your development. Learn what you want and where you want to go. And then you'll better be able to decide if your teacher is willing and able to help you towards that goal. And communicate it with them. Don't make them guess what you want to do. So if that teacher is purely equipped for producing soloists, world-renowned soloists, and that's not what you want to do, tell them that's not what you want to do. And they might say, we're not a good match, or they might say, okay, fine, let's rearrange how we go about your education. It depends. Now for the teacher, I think it's good both to encourage and help question the student regularly. What gets their fire going? What are they passionate about? Don't demean that. If it is something that's not as impressive as playing orchestrally or playing as a soloist, encourage that. There, again, 90%, probably more than 90% of the music that we enjoy is done at a layman's level. And there's absolutely a place for that. And I think that should be encouraged. I think it's an important skill. I think that there are many important skills that go into it beyond just continuously progressing in your technical ability. Now, I do think students can sometimes get this idea of, oh, I don't really have an interest in being a soloist. I'd rather do something a little less strenuous. They then can get this idea that they're off the hook for advancing. And that's where I would say you have a problem, because even if you're going to be playing more intermediate level music, if you are not improving upon your performance, you lose a lot of the joy that comes with music. It will become stale after a while. So, you can maybe increase the difficulty a little bit, or you can work on your expressivity. You can expand your musical knowledge of different genres and different songs, having a good catalog. To me, that's a skill. Having a good catalog of music to play for different occasions, that is a skill. And it's not something that we often really talk about as a skill, but it really is. How many people do you know who can just start singing a song and they're like the human jukebox? That's amazing. Same thing with playing. If you can just whip out something and play something, even if it's simple, you can entertain for hours. Now, to the teacher, again, I would say, don't demean students who want to play in a direction that maybe you're not as familiar with or interested in. And if that means connecting them with a teacher that you think would better suit them, if you have that ability, getting to know other teachers that have an interest beyond your interest, is great.
The next question that I think should be asked is, what is the balance of fun and drills, and how should that be maintained? Really, the answer to this is it does depend. Again, if you are looking to get into conservatory, it's probably going to be a harder drill, like a longer, harder drill season that just might not be as enjoyable. I'm comparing it to athletics because I think that they are so similar in the sense that those who are most successful put in a lot of hard work day in and day out. Now, if that is not your desire, if your desire is not to go to college for this or teach in any way or perform at a high level, let's just talk about pre-college students. Let's talk about students who don't have particular aspirations or goals that they're working for. The balance then of drills and fun is a lot about that mindset. So I've had students that have pleaded with me that I don't like the music. It's not interesting to me. If you picked a song that was interesting to me, I would want to play it more. And I've indulged that at times. And I'll say, okay, let's try it. I'll pick a song. They'll agree that they like that song. And within 2 weeks, they won't like it anymore. Because even if it's a fun song, sometimes the fun songs are more difficult because you figure out pretty quickly that you still have to work towards learning them, and then you stop liking the song that you previously liked. The bulk of your education is going to be drills. However, I do think as a teacher, I am constantly seeking how to make drills more fun. If you want to grow, you're going to have to learn to love the discipline of it. And I really want for my students to love discipline. So how do I make that fun? I've found different ways. For me, something I've gotten into over the last couple of years is looping. And that's not something that violinists tend to do. There are some, I'm not saying it's completely novel for violinists, but it's more of a guitarist, rock band type. That tends to be where you would find a looping skill rather than within the classical world. And I do teach more classical. Instead of using a metronome, sometimes I'll use a drum kit. If instead of clapping out the beat, I might pull out a cowbell or a snare drum and have them beat it out on that. Just something a little different, something to mix it up. But I still use a metronome or a drum kit, something that's going to keep the time. And I set up one of my students with a looping device, and I told him, if you want to do this right, you have to care about intonation and you have to care about rhythm, because as fun as looping is, it's just 10 times as frustrating if you get it wrong. And you're going to get it wrong in the beginning. So practice your rhythm, practice your intonation, because if you are recording something and it's just a little bit off, you are now going to hear it 100 times. That is, for example, like that's kind of a novel thing. It's fun. Kids like that kind of stuff, but you are still teaching the fundamentals. You are teaching the rhythm of it. You are teaching the importance of intonation. I do think it's really important to record your playing. I will sometimes record my students as they are playing in lesson. And then afterwards, I won't really have them look at it because a lot of them get self-conscious, or all they'll do is look. And I want them just to listen. So I'll play it back listening, and I'll have them tell me something that was good and something that they want to improve on. So making your progress measurable and then being able to say you did it, as opposed to just kind of keep going without ever kind of tuning in your student to what they're actually learning, I think helps them enjoy the drills a little bit more. There's some other things like using an abacus as, for repetitions, or especially with young kids, just having something tactile to mark their progress is really exciting. So there are things like that you can implement, but I do think that is my main goal overall, is to help them to learn to love the discipline. I don't think it's so much balancing, okay, we're going to do this amount of fun and this amount of drills. It is learning how to make the drills fun. And there are times, I will say, hey, if you are at a point in your practice where you're just frustrated and you literally can't hear anything good about your playing, go drink some water, take a break, come back and play a song that you're really comfortable with, that sounds good, just to kind of feel good about yourself again, feel good about playing again. I think that there's a time and place for that. Even with professional musicians, that is just a skill that you're going to learn as a musician, how to get out of that funky mindset of everything is horrible. Because once it feels that way, you're in this dangerous spot of, if you don't know how to course correct, or you don't know how to push through despite feeling that way, you will want to quit. I often tell my students, if they're in a funk, if they don't want to practice, if practice is such a drag, I'll give them tips. I'll give them tips to help. But ultimately, I tell them there's only one way that this funk will last forever, and that is if you stop playing. The funk will eventually go away if you keep playing. It might last longer than you want, but it will go away. It will most certainly not go away if you stop practicing. And I really think that is key to learn for any musician. The final question I want to ask is it possible for a student to poison the well of a teacher? I think this is a really interesting question, because I think we're in a time and place where often the burden of progress is solely put on the teacher. And as you can tell from my previous questions and answers, I don't think that that's how you should ever approach music. I don't think the teacher should ever be seen as the sole arbitrator of your development. They do have a lot of responsibility, and they should take that seriously. Just as Violin Mechanic pointed out, just because you're a great player doesn't mean you're a great teacher. And it can be hard for parents and students to really know if they have a good teacher or not. So that's a whole different topic for another day. But, for now, just the idea, speaking more in the abstract, I do think it's possible for a student to ruin the relationship with their teacher, but I do think it's much easier for it to be the other way around, especially initially. Again, this depends on the level of playing. I think for beginners, it is possible, but probably more possible for the parent to ruin it than for the student. And I'm not speaking from experience here. I have never had a student poison the well for me, thankfully. But I do think it's possible. And I do think that probably the tipping point for that would be when that student comes to the crossroads of I know what I want, and my teacher is telling me that this is the way to achieve it, and I just don't believe them, and I'm not going to do it. I think that that's the main thing. I'm not going to do it, because a teacher can tell you all different kinds of things, but if you don't actually put in the work for what the teacher is telling you to do, you really don't have the grounds to say if they were telling you the right thing or not. This isn't to say that you cannot make the decision, I don't think this teacher's right for me. I think that that's absolutely an okay thing to decide. Even if that teacher could be a great teacher, maybe they're not right for you. But that's a very different thing than saying that teacher just doesn't know and I'm going to do my own thing while maintaining a relationship with this teacher. It's very different to say, I'm going to seek out a new teacher who I think better matches me, than to say that teacher doesn't know what they're doing and I'm going to prove them wrong. And I think, again, that was something Violin Mechanic was hitting on in his video, is like, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's a relationship ultimately to help the student. And if you're not going to do what that teacher is requiring of you, you really don't have a place to tell that teacher that they're wrong. I do think that that is a way that you can poison the well of a teacher, is just blaming them for all your problems, but never having actually done the work. And again, with the TedX Talk, I don't know the whole relationship between, I'm not going to go and say that that's what happened with her, because you're only hearing one side of the story. You're not really hearing the teacher's side. You're only hearing her side. If her desire was to play professionally, a Violin Mechanic pointed it out very well, that you're playing a very virtuosic piece, but not at the level that it requires of you. So your teacher was probably right to send you back to the basics. And I would agree with that, because in my opinion, as difficult as it is to learn a virtuosic piece the slow and hard and long way, it's a lot harder to unlearn mistakes that you built in.
Another responsibility of the teacher is to learn how to communicate to their students what it is that they're learning, how they're progressing, and how they can improve. Teachers have to realize that different persons communicate in different ways. And I really like thinking about it as every student is a person. They are their own person. I'm also my own person. They have their limitations. I have my limitations. I should always be seeking to grow and improve in my ability to best work with my students as they come to me for who they are and not who I want them to be. But likewise, I'm not going to pretend like I don't have my own limitations, but not just limitations, ways of doing things, my own focus and passion, my own understanding. I can't teach what I don't know. Teachers should be, of course, looking to develop themselves in general as a musician, but also as a pedagogy, also as a teacher, as a communicator. You know, you can teach things properly, but if that student is really in a place of despair or questioning the methods that you're using, it might behoove you to figure out how to communicate to them what you're doing and why. And, you know, you can do that all right, and the student still might not listen to you. That is on them at a certain point. I do think you as a teacher should be trying to use everything at your disposal to communicate to them as best as you are able.
And I think that that is one of the burdens of the teacher, is knowing their students' limitations and how to work through them, and understanding that that can take time. And if a student doesn't want to go through that process and they're going to jump ahead, you know, it's one thing to say, I'm just going to play this piece and I'm going to play it for fun. That's perfectly fine. But if you're playing it to say, I want to prove you wrong and I can go in front of a crowd of people and perform it at performance level, but you weren't actually performance ready, then you're going to create a timeline in which you have to learn this piece, in which you have to perform it no matter if you're ready for it or not. And with that, you are going to entrench in your mind bad technique. And now you have to unlearn that bad technique, which I think is harder than learning it right the first time. And learning it right the first time doesn't mean you never make mistakes. It just means you kind of accept your own limitations and you accept the training ground to overcome some of those limitations and work within your current technical capability so that you can then go to the next technical capability with solid foundations. That's it. That's the conversation I have for today. And I hope this is helpful just from a teacher's perspective, but also as someone who is trying to understand and navigate. I really want this to be a joyous process for me and for my students, but I don't want to rob them of the technical abilities that it requires to really get the most joy out of musical development. If you enjoyed this, or if you have more thoughts, leave them in the comments below. You should totally check out Violin Mechanics video if you haven't, and his review on this TEDx talk that I think gets more into the specific technique. But I just wanted to broaden that conversation because I do think it's a very controversial one in terms of the student-teacher relationship. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and keep practicing, keep playing.